بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين. اللهم استخلفنا في الأرض كما استخلفت الذين من قبلنا ومكن لنا ديننا الذي ارتضى لنا وليبدلن من بعد خوفنا أمنا نعبدك ولا نشرك بك شيئا ومن كفر بعد ذلك فقد ضل سواء السبيل. اللهم ولي أمورنا خيارنا ولا تولي أمورنا شرارنا واختم بالباقيات الصالحات أعمالنا. اللهم ألف بين قلوبنا واصلح ذات بيننا واخرجنا من الظلمات إلى النور. اللهم إنا نسألك سلطان الأنبياء والمرسلين الملك والحكمة وتعلمنا مما تشاء وأنت أرحم الراحمين. لإيلاف قريش إيلافهم رحلة الشتاء والصيف فليعبدوا رب هذا البيت الذي أطعمهم من جوع وآمنهم من خوف. اللهم اجعلنا رحمة للعالمين أتم مكارم الأخلاق. نخرج الخلق من الظلمات إلى النور ونخرج الخلق من الظلمات إلى النور ونغفر للذين لا يرجون أيام الله ليجزيهم الله بما كانوا يعملون أو يتوب عليهم. ولولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته ما زكى منكم من أحد أبدا لاتبعتم الشيطان إلا قليلا لكنتم من الخاسرين. اللهم اجعلنا نقول قولا سديدا تصلح لنا أعمالنا وتغفر لنا ذنوبنا ونطع الله ورسوله ونفوز فوزا عظيما. This is a book, among many books. This is named The Truths We Hold. I'm going to read excerpts of it. I've read portions of this, most of it, not all of it. I'm going to revisit it just to share a perspective on the world of politics, international relations, history, and contextualizing reality according to people who are authorized to make decisions on our behalf. I'm just going to pick up a random section, as I do with other ones on this SANDC series, which is summary and notes, discussions and commentaries. It says, Kamala Harris for the people. The reason we have public offices of prosecution in the United States is that in our country, a crime against any of us is considered a crime against all of us. Almost by definition, our criminal justice system involves matters in which the powerful have harmed the less powerful. And we do not expect the weaker party to secure justice alone. We make it a collective endeavor. That is why, actually stating this here openly, prosecutors do not represent the victim, they represent the people, society at large. I kept that principle front and center as I worked with victims whose dignity and safety were always paramount for me. It takes an enormous amount of courage for someone to share their story and endure cross-examination, knowing their credibility and most personal details may be on the line. But when they take the stand, they are doing this for the benefit of each American or each individual person, or all of us, so that the rule of law can have authority and weight in society, and that there are consequences and accountability for those who choose to violate the laws that are deemed for the people. And this statement is her compass. There is nothing that she took more seriously than the power that she possessed at that time and still does in many senses. As an individual prosecutor, I had the discretion to decide whether to bring specific charges against a person, and if so, what those charges might be. She would negotiate plea agreements or arguments, provide sentencing, bail recommendations to people who are in the court system. Many argue there are other alternative ways outside of the court system as well. I just started out as a prosecutor, yet I had the power to deprive a person of their God-given, or in this case, United States-given liberties with a swipe of a pen. When it came time for closing arguments, she would approach the jury box. She would decide what to do without notes so that she wouldn't be looking down at a piece of paper or reading off a best argument for why they should or should not convict a specific person or defendant, or even a specific person within her authority, right, on their side as well. I wanted to look at the jurors in the eyes. I felt that I should know my case well enough that I could close my eyes and see the entire incident in 360 degrees. That means from each perspective, And that's extraordinarily powerful to say that. As she finished her closing arguments and headed back to the prosecutor's table, she would catch a glimpse of those sitting within the audience. And a friend she mentions here was at orientation, was sitting there with a big smile on her face, cheering her on. Now we were both on our way. The daily work is intense. At any given time, an individual prosecutor might be juggling more than X number of cases or hundreds, thousands of cases in some situations. It would start with the lower level work, arguing preliminary hearings, doing misdemeanor trials that cover things like DUI or petty thefts. As years passed, I got more and more trials under my belt, and she moved herself up the hierarchy of that office, or the office. In time, she would start prosecuting violent felonies, which took the work to whole new levels. She would pore over police reports, studying them, interviewing witnesses. She would sit with the coroner's offices and autopsy photographs, always cognizant that she was looking at someone's child and someone's parent or someone's loved one. When police arrested a suspect, she would go down to the police station and stand on the other side of these two-way mirrors and pass notes back and forth with investigators conducting interviews. Once she had started prosecuting felonies, she was assigned to homicide duties. She would be given a briefcase on an afternoon containing different levels of tech that allowed them to understand the penal code and a list of numbers to call. For the numbers of weeks that went off as far as technology, it was meant to study those types of instances and scenes, homicide scenes. Usually it meant leaping out of bed between midnight or 6 a.m. Her role was to make sure that evidence was collected in a proper way with all appropriate constitutional protections intact. That would be admissible in a court of law. She often had to explain to a person who had been victimized or their families that there is a difference between what they knew happened and what could prove to transpire. There is a giant chasm between arrest and conviction. If you want to get from one to the other, you need legally obtained evidence. I was at home in the courtroom. I understood its rhythm. I was comfortable with its idiosyncrasies. Eventually, I'd move into a unit that is extraordinarily difficult to explain here. What made these cases difficult was often the need to get a conviction. She has spent a lot of time in different hospitals that would describe the survivors and the unimaginable things that happen either publicly or privately to people experiencing pain or aggression of different sorts. These types of challenges led to the ability for someone to testify and the willingness, and these are the ones that are extraordinarily difficult to maneuver or understand because it is a position of power and powerlessness. There are some of those people who were more inclined to do things that are aggressive or predatory, and they would seek to harm other people regardless of the age that is listed here. It was not hard to feel the weight of these systemic problems that they were up against. Putting a person who did unspeakable things to young people are going to stop the cycle of the violence that she witnessed in her time there. She was also recruited across the bay to San Francisco District Attorney's Office. She was hired to run the career criminal unit, which focused on violent and serial offenders. She hesitated to go at it first, not just because she loved the work, but she had a reputation, and she was concerned by stories of dysfunction in the office. At the same time, she would be running a unit of prosecutors, and this was a chance to grow. And she listed how she had come into office and made sure that the backlogs were taken care of, uninvestigated scenarios were investigated, unprosecuted cases were prosecuted. Some lawyers were frustrated with different segments of the system for uninvestigated cases. Some people were frustrated with the office work because they were out there in the field, and it wasn't that they were failing to get convictions. The decisions were made at the top appeared to be arbitrary or random, and staff morale was close to rock bottom at that time. There were certain environments that made it worse, and there were cases where it was devastating. People cried and yelled, and their fear turned into some type of either paranoia or disgruntledness. Lawyers were afraid of one another, afraid of backstabbing by colleagues trying to protect their own jobs. Some people started skipping out in order to enjoy parties, or fired compatriots worried that their attendance would mark them as targets for firing too. It was incredibly frustrating. She believed the district attorney was, and this is simply my vision of a progressive prosecutor, was someone who used the power of the office with a sense of fairness, perspective, and experience, someone who was clear about the need to hold serious criminals accountable, and who understood that the best way to create safe, secure communities is to prevent crime in the first place. To do those things effectively and efficiently, you also need to run a professional operation. After 18 months, she got a lifeline. The San Francisco city attorney called her with a job offer. She was a groundbreaker. She was fearless, taking on entrenched interests ranging from manufacturers or companies to certain clubs that would promote their product or their service. There was an opening to lead the division in her office that handled child and family services. She wanted to know if she was interested. She told her she was willing to take the job, and she wanted to work on policy that could improve the system as a whole. Too often, young people in care systems migrated to detention systems or into adult criminal systems. That means they're marked for life as opposed to giving them opportunity or access to products or services that allow them, or educational areas, in order to allow them to avoid that devastating flow or stream of homelessness or getting marked within a system as that type of label. She spent the next 2 years at the city attorney's office. She started by confounding a task force to study the issues of exploited youth. She put up a group of experts, survivors, community members to help guide the work. A series of recommendations she presented to the SF Board of Supervisors, and there were specific people who partnered with her in that effort. She had first experienced these challenges as something that included prostitution, homelessness, addictions, and many of these stories uh, did not have a clean or happy ending. However, some did. Some of them cleaned their act up, went to college, got degrees in education or healthcare or other types of extraordinary work, and it was designed to rescue people from this disadvantaged beginning or deliberate system of disenfranchisement for women or people of color or people who had been born within a system that disadvantaged them. One of the priorities was creating safe spaces for youth to obtain true love and support and treatment. And for years of experience, these survivors were people who their parents were not in the picture. Many of them had run away from foster care. They wondered why exploited kids, or adults in some cases, had been picked up by the police and would go right back to these systems of exploitation who took care of them. It didn't seem so strange to me. Where else were the kids supposed to turn? Part of her work was to create safe houses and sanctuaries that would offer treatment for the type of abuse or aggression or disadvantage vulnerabilities that were created at an early age for these young people or people of color or women or other groups of people who were brought into a drug or abuse environment. So these types of people felt safe, they felt healthy, and they were given everything they were needed or wanted in order to stay on track to grow their own career, to make their own decisions, and to strengthen their own livelihood. In this case, they advocated for funding to create safe houses, as well to run a public education campaign. They would put posters up in public spaces, on buses, in homes, and they would provide information in order to end this type of systemic aggression or manipulation or addiction in some cases. It was important to disrupt this type of work in order to stop the madness. And a lot of this is my own commentary, so if you'd like to read the book, do so. To our delight, the Board of Supervisors adopted and funded these systems of safe housing and creating ways and means for people to grow their own career and strengthen their own livelihood and avoid the manipulative, predatory behaviors that are documented to disadvantage people. The work was meaningful, empowering, and it proved that serious policy work was being done. It also boosted her confidence that when I saw problems, I could be the one to devise the solutions. All those times that her mother had pressed her to say, well, what did you do about it? Suddenly made a lot more sense. I realized that I didn't have to wait for someone to take the lead. I could start making things happen on my own. I think it was a realization that I had turned my sights to elected office. Of all the problems I saw in front of me, few were in more urgent need of fixing than the specific office that I worked in at the DA's office. While we were making important gains at the city attorney's office, the district attorney's office was, in her view of it, self-destructing. Talented career prosecutors were seeing their efforts undervalued and feeling stymied in the vital work in which they had devoted their lives to. Meanwhile, violent felons were walking free, and she knew this. We all knew this, but suddenly it wasn't just an important problem to be solved. It is an important problem that she could solve. She wanted to honor, support, and empower the DA's office as a whole. But in order to run the office, I had to run for office. A political campaign would be a huge undertaking, and I had one clear choice: to embark upon it. And I turned to her friends, her family, or she turned to her friends and her family, her colleagues and her mentors, and they had long debates about what to do. They weighed the pros and cons, and then they went for it. People were generally supportive of the idea, but they were worried too. They were worried that opponents or former bosses were a household name. They also had a reputation as fighters. In fact, one of their nicknames was KO. That means to knock people out, a tribute to many of the knockouts they had scored in their boxing youth. A campaign would not only be bruising, but also expensive, and I had no experience to raise funds. Was this really the time for her to run? She had no way of knowing, but more and more obvious, she had the feeling wait and see isn't an option. She thought of James Baldwin in these words: there is never a time in the future in which we will work out our own salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now. And I'll read this one more time because it is inspirational to understand. I always say al-Sufi or al-Zahid ibn waqtiha or ibn waqti. That means work is to be done in the moment. It is to enjoy the moment. It is also to decide in the moment to make meaningful progress and change. There is never a time in the future in which we will work out our own salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر لي ولكم سائر المسلمين التحيات لله والصلوات والطيبات والبركات. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته، والسلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين